Well, thank you for your warm welcome. This is my second European event of the day. I started this morning at Hyde Park Corner, a big pro-Europe, anti-Brexit rally, and now I've got you. And both of them encouraging in the sense that, you know, people haven't given up, and, you know, there's still a fight around this subject. And it's symbolically important because London and Scotland, of course, are the two big bastions of Remain, or exit from Brexit, as we now call it. And that's something we've got to build on. I mean, I'm aware that the political context is, of course, very different. In England, you know, we're the only unambiguously pro-Remain, anti-Brexit party. In Scotland, it's a broader church. I'm assuming that this is a broader audience than my party. I've just had the pleasure of meeting my local activists, but I'm assuming that we have a broader group here, and that's the spirit in which I'm addressing here. It's a particular pleasure being here for several reasons. I mean, one is I actually probably haven't seen me around, but I come up to Perth quite a lot. I have family who live nearby. More important in a way. I mean, the real reason I'm here isn't to speak to you. I'm not putting that very well, am I? I'm coming here. I'm piggybacking on an invitation that I have tomorrow morning. I'm speaking at the Crime Writers Festival, because in my 2 years of sabbatical or exile, whatever you want to call it, I became a writer, novelist. My novel appeared this week. Actually, it's in Waterston. It's called Open Arms. So I'm hoping to rub shoulders with Ian Rankin and the great Scottish writers tomorrow. And so that's the real reason I'm in Scotland. I heard you were here, so I thought that's great. Let's do both of them. The other reason it's a pleasure to be here is that I'm one of the few people around, I think, who is a veteran of the 1975 referendum in Scotland. Those of you who know my checkered history will know that I was a Glasgow City Councillor in the early 70s. I was actually Labour before the switch to the SDP and the Lib Dems. And the build-up to the referendum in Scotland at that time was quite interesting. It was the exact opposite of where we are today, because at that stage in history, it was the Tory party that was pro-Europe. Heath, you know, the CBI, all these, you know, it was that was where the real energy was coming from. And I vividly remember going around miners' clubs in Midlothian and Ayrshire, you know, arguing against the lions of the Labour Party, like late Robin Cook, who, of course, were passionately anti-Europe, and that was where British politics was. There were some exceptions. I mean, the great John Smith, you know, late John Smith, leader of the Labour Party, was amongst the people on the left who were arguing for Europe, and I later had the honour of working for him, actually. But by and large, right and left were the exact opposite of where they are today. And it's peculiar because in some ways some of those old attitudes that persist. Jeremy Corbyn is anti-Europe, pro-Brexit, largely as a legacy of those debates in the 70s, and you know, that's in a way one of the political complexities that we're dealing with today. But I thought I'd try to address three questions, and then we'll have a public debate about it. I think, first of all, the question I want to ask is Brexit inevitable? Is it going to happen? What's the possibility, the probability of it not happening? That's the first question. I think, secondly, do we have any signals so far about where it's leading, what the consequences are? And thirdly, if we don't like it, what can we do about it, at a personal and at a political level? Let me just deal with the first. I think the common assumption is that Brexit will happen. A lot of people who voted Remain have shrugged their shoulders and said, well, okay, it was bad, but, you know, okay, let it happen, let the government do what they've got to do. Rather fatalistic. I don't take that view, actually. I think there is a fair possibility, maybe even a probability, that this whole thing will unravel. And probably in a very messy way, but I think we may well find in 18 months' time that it simply isn't possible for the UK government to deliver this. And I think there are several reasons for believing that. I mean, one of them is the sheer, utter complexity of what they've got themselves into. It was sold very dishonestly. You know, you still get people standing up in the House of Commons saying, well, what's all the fuss, we can get out tomorrow afternoon. But you can't get out tomorrow afternoon. It is a very complex process. And the reason for it is that the main institution that lies at the heart of the European project, at least in economic terms, is the single market, which isn't, you know, as we all know, it isn't just getting rid of old tariffs from the past. It's building up over a period of 30 years, a common approach to regulation, common approach to standards. You know, thousands and thousands of technical agreements have been signed over this 30-year period. And, you know, what the British government's trying to do, and suddenly realising how difficult it all is actually getting out of them and renegotiating them and redefining them. And some of them are already in public debate. I mean, an obvious example, which nobody in the Brexit campaign ever thought about before we embarked on this, is airlines. Everything to do with airlines, you know, landing rights, air traffic safety, ticketing, environmental emission standards, it's all governed by European rules. And unless within the next 6 months, they can come to some kind of understanding, we will be in a completely anarchic arrangement, because there will be no rules governing aviation, because they do ticket sales 1 year ahead. Now, multiply that by hundreds, and you get some sense of the complexity of what's involved. We've already discovered, for example, I don't think there is an offshoot of this in Scotland, but the Euratom, which is Britain's combined research work with the European Union on nuclear issues, which affects us all indirectly because of, you know, isotopes and affects radiography, is subject to quite a complex European agreement that we would have to renegotiate. And suddenly a realization that all of these things are far too complicated to sort out in a year or 18 months. One I came across yesterday, I wasn't aware of it, but blood products, right? Blood, you know, we need it for transfusions. Every hospital depends on how, but actually the standards of blood and the potential, of course, for contamination, you know, the history of disasters that have happened. The standards are maintained by very complex European negotiated processes. And once that breaks down, what happens to the blood supply? You know, it's possible that lots of clever people will succeed in sorting out all these technical problems in the next year, but I doubt it. And of course, the other aspect of complexity is that what the government is now trying to do is to say, okay, and the more intelligent ones anyway are trying to say, we realise this is a problem, so what we will do is we'll get out, but we'll have a so-called transitional period in which all these technical issues around trade and you know, commerce and standard setting, these will all be negotiated in a more gradual and orderly way. And it's, you know, it's in a way it's a common sense thing to say. But now we're beginning to reflect on what the transition means. It's less clear how you make it happen. Essentially, there are now two views on this. One of them, the view that's been put forward in the Labour Party, this is Keir Starmer, which is that the way you secure a transition is by Britain accepting all the rules of the European Union and single market, even though we don't any longer have any say in them. And that is logical, but it's not a good logic. I mean, you know, if you want to have, you know, if you're going to be in the single market, surely we want to have some control over it. But anyway, that's That's one approach to it. The view that the government's taking is utterly illogical, and I'm afraid is going to end in grief, because what they're saying is we want a transition, we want an orderly process, but we want to do our own thing. So once we've left the European Union, we're going to stop migrants coming in, but we want all the other things. You know, this is classic, you know, having cake and eat it. The European Union has made it very clear that is not on. You're either in or you're not. So if they try to push this idea of having a transitional arrangement, which is entirely on British terms, it's not going to happen. So what we are going to finish up with, as these negotiations progress, is a choice between a very messy exit, in which we basically jump off a cliff and hope it all sorts itself out, or just not doing it. And that, I think, is where the exit from Brexit will become apparent. A lot of the more moderate people, when they see this and the stark clarity of it becomes apparent, I think may well back off. So I think that's one big reason why I think that, you know, Brexit could perhaps not happen. I think the other reason is because of what's happening politically. At the moment, opposition to Brexit, firm opposition, consists of my party, the Nationalists, small parties. We have one Green in Westminster, having a common front, but we're only very much a minority, relying on Labour rebels, and there are 50 of them that have so far surfaced. There may be others. And potentially Tory rebels, though not a single one apart from Ken Clarke has yet voted against the government on fundamentals of Brexit. However, that may well be unstable, because as we progress, I think more and more Labour people are going to feel uncomfortable with being a Brexit party. We'll get growing tensions. They're, I think, very cleverly actually trying to head this off. I think what Starmer's been doing the last few weeks is very smart politically, and they're positioning themselves quite well. But so we may get more support from the Labour Party, although there are core people like the leadership who are not going to go along with it. And we may begin to get more tension and conflict within the Conservative Party. A lot of them are very unhappy. Some of them are not unhappy about Brexit, but they're very unhappy about the way this is being ran through Parliament, taking away a lot of powers that currently exist in Parliament and then putting them in the hands of the executive. So there are all kind of political reasons why I think this could start to unravel once it becomes messy and nasty, as it will, as the months go by. So that's my answer to the first question. Will it happen? I think the honest answer, probably, but it's quite strong reasons for believing that under certain circumstances it might be stopped or stoppable. Now the second question is, what's Brexit actually doing? Is it, you know, are we seeing any impacts? When will we see them? I think one of the problems here is that the referendum campaign by Remain was a bit of a disaster, and one of the reasons it was a disaster was it was exaggerated, and this whole Project Fear stuff. I mean, I know this has got resonance in Scotland for other reasons, but you know, that we're all going to have a complete collapse if we leave. Of course, it didn't happen. It was never going to happen, because that's not the way economies work. What we did have was a big fall in the currency. You know, 20%, the biggest devaluation since the Second World War. Not too many people have noticed it unless you travel abroad. I just come back from a short holiday in Ireland, exchanging my pound for €1. You know, you then realise actually something's happening in the world. This has made a difference. But so far that hasn't yet percolated through very strongly into people's living standard. It's eroding it, but not in any very dramatic way. We're seeing already much of business not pulling out of the UK, but just not investing, sitting on piles of cash. a lot of uncertainty. I mean, why would you? I mean, if you're a company and you're trying to think of how to invest your shareholders' money, and you're worrying about uncertainty, why are you going to build a factory or a new office development linked to the European market under this environment? And you know, they're just behaving rationally and they're sitting on their hands. And we're going to see over the next 2 or 3 years more and more evidence that investment just isn't happening. Now, I personally I don't really believe in the kind of Armageddon stuff that George Osborne and others were peddling. I think the worry actually is that Brexit will gradually affect us, but it will be a kind of car crash in slow motion. It will evolve over time. You know, in years to come, we will be relatively poorer, but not necessarily in some cataclysmic way. But I think it will gradually start to erode business confidence and people's standard of living, and we'll see that. And as governments get less revenue, because they will, you're already beginning to see a lot of people migrating out of the financial services industry. You have very high paid people who pay a lot of tax, just drifting abroad. Tax base of the government goes down, capacity for public spending goes down, and this in turn feeds through into public services. We can already begin to see that happening, and Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, to his credit, has been honest that that is actually what's going on. And we're going to feel that more and more. So I think the answer to the second question is we are beginning to see the economic costs, but they're not necessarily going to hit us between the eyes. I mean, it may well be a slow and protracted process. Now, the third question is, if people are worrying about this, and I think many people are, I meet great numbers of people who are actually worried stiff about Brexit and what it's going to do to the country. What can we do about it? You know, the vote's happened, it's in the past, you know, Article 50 was triggered, the negotiations are happening. Is there any way out? Is there an exit from Brexit? I think there are two steps in all this. I think there is the Westminster Parliament. I think, you know, the negotiations are running in parallel with an attempt to change the law in quite a dramatic way. There is a bill going through Parliament, Great Repeal Bill, which actually, at first sight, is quite sensible. It's about saying, look, if we are leaving the European Union, let's translate the whole of European law into British law. But actually, the way that it's been done will give future UK governments enormous power just to play around with regulations pretty much as they want without any kind of parliamentary scrutiny. So that if you, for example, you had a British minister who decided that, under pressure from commercial lobbies, that we shouldn't worry too much about air quality standards. Just take an example. Or the commitments we make on global warming. These can now be pushed through Parliament much more easily than they could before. So Parliament is important. I mean, I've been an MP now for 20 years. Much of that time, MPs were decorative. They didn't actually do very much. There were enormous majorities, and Parliament wasn't crucial, but it is now. This UK Parliament is very narrowly balanced, at least in theory, and there is the scope for substantially affecting outcomes. But I think that in itself doesn't take us very far. I think the big issue is whether we try to engage the public in another popular vote. And what my people are arguing, and I think great numbers of people are, the Mayor of London, others, is that at the end of the negotiation, we've got to be able to offer the public a choice, right? Do you want to go ahead with all this when you know what's involved, or you know more about what's involved, or do you want an exit from Brexit? I think, unfortunately, and I guess I and my party are as guilty of this as others, that we've used this phrase second referendum, and I think in some ways that gave the false impression, because the reaction to it, has not been great. I don't know what it was like in Scotland, but certainly in England, I had a strongly Remain constituency, but nonetheless the reaction was, oh, go away, you know, we've done it, we don't want to go over all this again. And, you know, the public have voted, rightly or wrongly, accept it, forget it, move on. That was what I was getting on doorstep or doorstep. So we're not arguing, actually, or we shouldn't be arguing for rerunning the last referendum. I don't think there's any great appetite for that, whatever you may think about it. What I think there is potentially an appetite for is saying that when the facts are known, we actually have a vote on the destination rather than on the principle of leaving, which of course we've already had. And it's a different set of questions. It's about the facts as we then know them. It's a fundamentally different question. Now, a lot of people say to me, well, we're just fed up with referendums. This is not a great way to make decisions. I happen to agree with that. I don't, you know, we've overdone referendums in the UK. Reducing complex issues to a simple binary choice is not a great way to govern countries. But you know, the problem is we've started down this road, and you know, and I think if a British political party or government tried to cancel Brexit without going back to the public, you just get a permanent souring of the mood and a kind of ugly disaffection that would continue for probably decades. And in order to delegitimise, I'm sorry to put it in rather pompous language, the referendum we've had before, I do think we would have to get an extra vote on where we're heading. And so that's why I'm building my own campaigning around that theme. That, you know, we've had a referendum, you know, it's happened, government's embarked upon negotiations, but at the end of it, when we know the facts, when we knew where it's heading, we want the public to have a choice. Do they want to go ahead, even if it means jumping off a cliff, or do you want an exit from Brexit? And I think actually that politically, that's I think the campaign that we now have to build up. So thank you for being attentive. Very happy to debate, deal with questions around those themes. So, thank you very much. First thing is to stay in existence, and the battle isn't over. You know, it's just beginning. This is a long process, and it will require stamina. And although I think, you know, one of the people who I probably have least in common with politically is Nigel Farage, but you have to admire the way those guys kept plugging away for year after year after year. They didn't give up. They had a cause, they believed in it, and they kept campaigning, they waited for their chance, and they kept going. And I think the Remain, the exit from Brexit movement, which is very strong, as I say, in parts of England and all of Scotland, I think we've just got to keep going. You've got to, stamina is, I think, going to matter. Even if we lose this battle, even if Brexit goes ahead, I suspect that in 5 or 10 years' time, people will be saying, OMG, you know, oh my God, why we got into this mess? The issue about rejoining may well arise. And so that's why the movement has got to be kept intact, has got to continue campaigning. I mean, I don't know what the political style is in Perth, but, you know, getting people out on the streets, street stalls, leafleting, all these things, you know, they matter. And I think the more people see it, the more they will say, you know, these guys haven't given up. You know, this is not a done deal. So keeping up the visibility, keeping up the campaigning, however you do it here, seems to me fundamental to the way forward. Well, you put your finger on one of the many things that could result in this whole process grinding to a halt. I mean, of course, there are three elements in the current negotiations. One is the divorce bill, second is Ireland, and the third is the role of migrants, or Europeans based here and British in Europe. But just specifically on Ireland, I mean, at the moment the government's sort of living in a fantasy world. I mean, they're just assuming that you can introduce a border in Northern Ireland to check the movement of goods, which you have to do if you leave the customs union, and to check the movement of people, because that's inherent in the single market, without somehow anything happening to Ireland. But, you know, this is not deliverable. And there is a very simple choice, actually, that if they want Brexit, they will have to introduce an effective border in Northern Ireland, which nobody in Ireland, the island of Ireland, wants. Or they will have to introduce a border through the middle of the Irish Sea, which will mean that whenever somebody from Northern Ireland goes back home, they're crossing a national frontier. Now, I can't see either of those two things ever being acceptable. Because this government are in a coalition with the DUP, we tend to forget that, but actually that's the one thing that's keeping the British government on the road at the moment. They're very unlikely to do anything that will compromise the position of the DUP. So you're not going to get a border through the Irish Sea. So they will then be tempted to try and introduce some kind of virtual border in Northern Ireland, and they've come up with this weird idea. We've got some new technology that will enable lorries to cross frontiers without being stopped, and we'll somehow detect it and we'll sort it out somehow. Nobody's ever seen this technology in action. It's got to be invented in the next 18 months. The mind boggles, and I think the Irish government will simply say, sorry, this is just ridiculous, we can't agree to this. And of course it goes to the heart of what the negotiations are all about, that we're not just dealing with Mr. Juncker and Mr. Barnier. You're dealing with 28 governments, or 27 others, every one of which has to agree. And if the Irish government vetoes it, there is no agreement. So we've left, but we've not no agreement on what happens afterwards. That is the kind of nightmare. I think the initial scare that people somehow are going to be kicked out, obviously that's not valid, but it is a very worrying time, and I mean, people like yourself, I wouldn't be surprised if you feel somewhat insecure, and maybe just rejected. I mean, I happen to have a Slovakian daughter-in-law, and you know, she's been here 20 odd years, fluent English, married to my son, very British, and she said for the first time in her life she felt quite frightened after the Brexit vote. You know, that I'm in a country where they don't want me, and I don't think we fully got to the depths of the challenge to the identity of Europeans staying here. And I went 2 weeks ago to my local hospital, and the one thing they told me was happening was they're now getting a growing flood of European health service workers leaving the country. And I said, why is this? Because, you know, they're not going to be thrown out. Why are they leaving? And they said what had happened was that after the referendum, they applied for British nationality. And they found that they were then sent an 83-page form. And then when they tried to get help from the Home Office, they got very aggressive clerks, being extremely unhelpful and basically telling them to stop wasting their time, we don't really want them in the country anyway. And a lot of the time, if this is what Britain is about, we're off. And what is happening now, and it's the brightest and the best, you know, it's the people who are making a real contribution to the country, who are just not willing to accept this kind of treatment, so they're steadily drifting away. I suspect that under these negotiations, that probably is one of the three things that we will get some agreement on, because, I mean, nobody actually wants to lose the Europeans we have here, and the British people in Europe need to be protected too. I mean, what is wicked, though, and absolutely wicked, is to use them as bargaining chips. That is absolutely wrong. And I would hope that in the campaigning that you keep doing, we focus on this issue, which is, you know, the right to remain. And again, I'm not sure about Scottish local government, but next May, presumably, will you have council elections here?
No.
Oh, okay.
Just had one.
Certainly in many parts of England and Wales you do. And unlike in the general election, the Europeans will have a vote. And in an area like mine, about 10% of the local people are European background, and they will use their vote, and I know who they're going to use it against. So that's one way, actually, of mobilising people and getting firm foothold in this debate. Well, that's true of many things. When I was in the coalition government, we did what we call a review of competencies, and of course one of the things which, because I was responsible for the business department, which in turn has responsible for regulation. And one of the things we were confronting were small business groups complaining about regulation. And what we found out was whenever we looked at a regulation that was considered highly onerous for British business, in almost every case it was because the British government had gold-plated it, or because it was being implemented in a particularly crass and heavy-handed way. If I just give you one important example, one of the things I tried to do in my period in the government was to try and introduce an industrial strategy. Actually, we made a lot of progress with it. And one of the things which kicked it off was a process of procurement for railways. What had happened was that there was a massive contract for something called Thameslink, which is a link going across London north to south. And there was a bidding for the carriages, the trains. And it was carried out by the Department of Transport. And the contract went to Siemens in Germany to basically bring in trains from Germany. And the effects of it would have been that the big Bombardier plant in Derby was effectively going to close. And it caused an absolute upheaval on politics. And I managed to reach an agreement with Philip Hammond, who was then the Transport Secretary, that although that contract had to be honoured, in future we'd do something differently. So what we did, we sent our officials off to Germany and France to find out how they did contracts for railways. And the Germans and the French just laughed. You know, what are you people playing at? Of course we try to help our local industries. It's entirely compatible with European Union rules. You know, you just need to, you know, you can't be protectionist, but, you know, you can tell your local companies 5 years ahead, you've got a plan on this, we'll try and help you with the contract, and you can comply with the law. But what was happening with the British were massively overindulging the so-called competitive rules around procurement. And this was happening in many, many areas. And a lot of British businesses have been suffering, you know, over-regulation as a result of British gold plating. Nothing to do with the European Union at all. And of course that's quite apart from these caricatures of straight bananas and square tomatoes and all the rest of it. Well, I did refer to this in passing. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, I may not be explaining this properly, but in this so-called repeal bill, what's happening is that the government is transferring tens of thousands of European rules into British law. That's essentially what's happening. The problem with is that some of these are quite controversial, and ministers may be tempted to interfere with them. And in order to ensure that doesn't happen, you need to have a proper system of scrutiny in Parliament, i.e. What sometimes, primary legislation, which is new law, or affirmative action, which is that MPs get a vote on it. And the criticism of what the government's doing is that they're pushing through all of these things in such a way that members of Parliament will not ever have a vote or proper scrutiny of it. And that's what's called the Henry VIII powers. Well, I mean, I can see why you think that way. I mean, there is. I didn't come here to do a kind of tribal argument. I mean, there is an argument between the Lib Dems and the Nationalists over this issue, because we both favour a second referendum or a new referendum on Europe, but not on independence. And the argument that my party would put forward is that when we want a new referendum on Europe, it's not rerunning the last one and asking people to think again about it. It's actually voting on a new set of facts which follow negotiations. So it is quite an important distinction. But I mean, in a way, that's an argument for Scottish politics, which you have to have with my Lib Dem friends. But I mean, clearly the situation in Scotland will change. I mean, if we do leave the European Union, you will no longer be a part of Europe, and I would imagine that there are strong feelings about it here. But of course, it's not just Scotland. Let's be clear about that. And people in London feel equally passionately about it, but from a different standpoint. And they feel their identity is threatened in the same way, because London is outward-looking, open, cosmopolitan, and they're being boxed into a country which could well be dominated by English nationalism, essentially. So it isn't just a Scottish issue, the identity question. Yes, that could well happen. At the moment, the British economy is sort of coasting along. It's not doing particularly well, but it's not catastrophic. On one level, it is one of the things we've discovered since the banking crisis 10 years ago is that it's possible for economies to grow a bit, which is what's been happening, that people are no better off. And what's happened since the banking crisis. Wages, once you allow for inflation, are no higher than they were 10 years ago. And in some cases it's a lot lower. And the devaluation of the currency has made that quite a bit worse, because we're now importing food and fuel at higher prices, which people are getting paid for, though the wages are not going up. So people are being squeezed. Now, you can envisage a situation, it could happen in a year's time, that these negotiations get into a critical stage. There's no agreement on Ireland, no agreement on the divorce settlement, maybe no agreement on European nationals. The whole thing breaks down. Massive uncertainty. The one thing we know will happen under those circumstances is that the pound will collapse. Because governments can't control, we've got a flexible currency, it goes up and down, the markets determine it, dealers will be taking a view on the future. And another big devaluation would have a really critical effect on people's living standards. And I think that's one of the things that could well change the popular psychology. The other thing that could happen, it hasn't happened yet, is that one of the really big totemic companies decides to pull out. There are some that are quite near the edge. I know them because I dealt with them when I was in government as business secretary. Airbus is a good example. You have some of the supply chain up here, but its main fabrication is in Wales. You've got tens of thousands of jobs. They may well decide that their future is in France. It's a French-owned company. You don't want to stay around in the UK. if all the little widgets that go backwards and forwards have to be tested every time they go across a frontier. One of the big car companies could decide this is not for us anymore. I know because one of the things I did quite successfully in government was negotiating with General Motors. I went to Detroit to talk to the guys there. They were thinking of pulling out and going to Germany, and we persuaded them to stay. That was near Port, near Liverpool, and at Luton. On the basis that we were still part of Europe, they have access to the European market. If that goes, why would they want to stay? I mean, there must be companies up here which are in a similar kind of knife-edge position. If one or two of them went, that would hit the public psychology in a way that nothing else would, I think. Well, certainly the Labour opposition are pushing for an early election, but actually there's no, providing the Tory party doesn't implode, whatever else you say about them, they've got a very good instinct for staying in power. They're likely to hang on, because they know they get a roasting if they went to the public, and they've got the DUP with them. So they've got a working majority. They're not going to go to the country unless something remarkable happens to change it. So well, yeah. Well, it may. I mean, my expectation is that whether or not we get a referendum, there is quite likely to be an election, I would think, in 2 years' time. Because what they will try to do, I think this is the scenario, and it's quite a worrying one actually, is that they will get, the negotiations may break down, because there are some of the reasons we've given. Ireland, divorce payment, may break down. We're not able to get any transitional. You're faced with a real, do we jump off a cliff or not? And the way they deal with it is by whipping up a lot of feeling in the UK about these foreigners in France and Germany screwing up our country. The Union Jack will be waved in a very aggressive way, and they then call an election in which it's, who rules? Do we rule our own country, or is it these monsters in Europe? And who knows what will happen if, nationalism, British nationalism, is let off the hook in that kind of way. And I think there's a real danger of getting a general election fought under those conditions. Again, I say north of the border, it's a different dynamic altogether, but I've seen enough of it in parts of England to know that that kind of campaign would really catch on in some areas. Well, it's a very complicated story. I think when people first started addressing this issue of overseas nationals, it was seen as a fairly straightforward issue. Well, people either stay and become British residents or they don't. But then gradually it began to dawn on the government that this isn't as simple as that at all. It's all about pension entitlements and which bits of benefits people should be allowed to have, whether they should be allowed to vote, and if so, in which elections. And what should have been quite a simple issue, if we'd simply said as a country that the Europeans are here, let's just accept they're here, they're welcome to stay, residents, no problem. What has now become a very complex negotiating issue, in which we're haggling about whether European nationals are entitled to their national insurance payments and in return for British people on the Costa Brava having their pensions and their health and so on. So it's becoming very, very messy indeed. And I would hope, one of the political campaigns I think we should be running is to simply draw a line on this and say, look, the people who are here, they're welcome, no future question, and they would have basic residency rights.
But for British people who would want EU membership, for example...
Sorry, I missed your question.
Yeah, for someone who, for example, is studying languages like me, who wants to live in Europe, would you think that could be a possibility?
Well, if you were living in Belfast, you could do that. There is one of the oddities of the system at the moment is that if you live in Northern Ireland, you can be both European and British at the same time because you're part of the island of Ireland. So you could indeed become a European living in Britain as a British national. But that option is currently not open to British people. But no, sorry, I have heard that argument before, and it's an intriguing one, and perhaps we should make more of it. That people voluntarily be saying, we want to stay as Europeans. I mean, the one way in which that is a practical problem is, of course, most of us have now got these purple passports, right? And, you know, presumably we're not going to give them up. So at least we keep that. Yeah, no, that is true. I'm not quite sure where your question was leading, but of course there are people who would argue that if Britain crashes out, we should get rid of all the European rules and regulations around environment and labour standards. Is that what you're saying? That we should become an absolutely full-blooded, capitalist economy? I think actually that's a very minority view even in the Tory party these days. And then we had the Thatcher Revolution 30 years ago. I think that's history. I don't sense there's much of an appetite for it again. And very strikingly, last week in Parliament when David Davis was being cross-questioned, he repeatedly said that the European environmental and labour standards are the minimum, not the maximum. Now that may have been, for your benefit, and I'm sure there are people that are out there who would love to get back to the wonders of the Thatcher years, but I don't think it's likely. I don't think the political strength is there to deliver that anymore. I think it is retrievable. The sense I get, and many of you travel abroad and you'll have contacts, is that the Europeans are not so much angry as puzzled, and even pitiful, actually. I sensed this in Ireland, and I was on holiday. It wasn't sort of anti-British, it was, what the hell are you people playing at? You're behaving in a completely absurd, self-harming way. What's wrong with you guys? There was more that spirit, I think. There is a scenario I painted earlier where the things break down, and we then get, nationalism, or British nationalism is then let loose. Then, of course, you will get a reaction and a counter-reaction. But I don't think at the moment there's any kind of vindictive and fundamentally anti-British feeling, even amongst the people we're negotiating with. And I think that if we decided through a referendum or some other way to rethink all this, I think their attitude would be, thank God, one less problem to worry about, and they will go through the motions of saying, you have to be told off by the head teacher for misbehaving, but come back, all is forgiven. I think that would be very much, certainly now, I think that is very much the mood. I won't claim to understand the mindset of the DUC. As you know, I spent several years in Glasgow, and the Orange movement was quite strong there, and you got to know quite a lot of Orangemen. But the thing that I always found with the DUP, and I was in Parliament, I used to sit next to Ian Paisley on the back bench. And he's a lovely guy, actually. He was a lovely guy. He was on one level, lovely, and then very courteous, very friendly. And I always found the hardline Ulster Unionists, if you talk to them on any other subject than Northern Ireland, were often very enlightened. But when we got them on Northern Ireland, the eyes started swivelling, and it was completely impossible to pursue a sensible conversation. And I'm not sure what they want, actually, because, of course, many of their farmers in the south of Ulster, you know, their power base are the kind of Protestant farmers near the border. Many of those want to protect agriculture, and of course that will go with Brexit. Many, you know, they depend very heavily on European assistance. It's a bit like Wales. And why Wales voted Brexit is beyond anybody's comprehension. Northern Ireland is a bit the same. So they want the money and they want the benefits, but politically they want out. And of course that's largely driven by, you know, the fact that the Irish and Sinn Féin are kind of theoretically pro-Europe. So it's a very strange mindset. But anyway, they've now dug themselves into a position where they're saying, well, you know, we want a hard Brexit. I suspect myself, and maybe I'm misreading it, is that I think under the kind of weird views that they often have, they're quite pragmatic. I mean, after all, they've sat down with McGuinness, you know, for 10 years. I mean, these are quite, you know, practical people when it comes to it. And I think they're probably more likely to compromise than the kind of right wing of the Tory party. Well, that's asking the previous question in a very friendly way, but I will be completely cowardly and not answer. Because it's the big divide, I think, between one tribe and another here. Well, it could happen. I suppose I'm a little bit older than Mr. Macron, but it is a role model that it could happen. I mean, there's all kind of scenarios about how this could play out. But if things become really, really bad politically, and it could happen, you know, failure of negotiations, you know, economic crisis, all these things happening, then the rigid tribal political divisions, certainly in England, might well change quite radically, and people start looking for other alternatives. And my people are there, and you know, loosely in the centre ground, and we could get a massive boost of support come through the middle. It's quite difficult under the British voting system to do that, but it could conceivably happen. As it happens, I dealt quite a lot with Macron because he was my opposite number in the French government, in the socialist administration. And I think the interesting thing about him, some of the honeymoon's already going anyway, but is whether it'll be crucial to the European project whether or not he succeeds. Because if he doesn't, there is a real risk that extreme politics could reignite in France. And you know, you have the National Front, and you know, the people, Mélenchon, the people on the left, are not as threatening in some ways, but pretty extreme. And you will then get a sense of a crisis in Europe. The moment there isn't one, you know, there's a lot of optimism in the European Union. They're getting on top of their problems. The Eurozone crisis has receded. And indeed, that's one of the reasons why they're being quite tough in the negotiation with the UK, because there's a lot of real kind of self-confidence in Europe that wasn't there 2 years ago. But if Macron were to fail, then, you know, it will not help them, and it will feed the people in Britain who say, well, Europe's just a mess, let's get out of it. And that's something we need to watch carefully. I mean, I think there are two areas where you know, dishonesty was a very potent. I mean, one of them was this idea about getting our money back. We all know that is a complete falsehood, a canard. And I think one of the problems that the British government has is when they come to a divorce settlement, we don't know whether it will be 40 billion or 50 billion, it will be explaining to all those UKIP voters that we're having to pay lots of money rather than get lots of money back. And that's one of the things that could cause a big fracture in the Tory party, actually. And it's one of the things that could cause a breakdown in the negotiations, because politically they may not be able to sell it. So that the cash settlement is one. The other, which is a kind of more subtle thing, but I think is becoming increasingly important to the argument, is this idea that, if we leave the European Union, okay, it's a bit painful, but it doesn't really matter because we can then negotiate lots of trade agreements with the rest of the world. That idea has got stuck in the public imagination, and a lot of people believe it, and it is superficially quite plausible. But what we're now discovering is that it is actually complete nonsense, absolute nonsense. And basically, Theresa May went to India. They're not interested. She was told to get on a bike. I'm putting it crudely, because why would they want to negotiate a special deal with Britain rather than 500 million people in Europe? And the Japanese were equally forthright. They said we're much more interested in having an agreement with Europe. If you want to copy it, that's fine, but we're not doing anything special with you. The Americans, interestingly, even the Trump administration, is now saying that they use this wonderful American phrase, bandwidth, right? Britain, 60 million, 500 million here, where's the bandwidth, right? And Trump's, as you know, his attention span isn't great. He's sent friendly tweets, but friendly tweets don't deliver very complicated trade agreements, and of course the American Congress then has to approve it. So the idea that you'll get some alternative trade arrangements by leaving is becoming a fantasy. And so you're losing something that affects 40% or more of our commerce. And not just that, but agreements with about 60 countries, all the former Commonwealth in Africa and the Caribbean, North Africa, Korea, others, all those agreements lapse if we leave. And so we're in a poorer position than we were before. So that is one of, if I were a barrister, I think I probably could just about make a case for Brexit. But that particular argument is just so absurd, but it's so persistent. And I think as time passes, the absurdity of it will become apparent. Yes, I am optimistic, because I think this can be turned around. I've described to you some of the circumstances in which it can happen. I'm not over-claiming. I mean, it could go the wrong way. They'll kind of, it's a bit like snakes and ladders, right? We're currently at the bottom of one of the snakes, but there are plenty of ladders on the board, and I'm optimistic that I think with good political campaigning and people like you staying with the faith, it can be turned around. And net, I'm optimistic. Well, the government has said that Parliament can vote on the outcome. We're not quite sure we believe them, and we're not quite sure what form that will take, because last week they said Parliament will not have a vote on the divorce settlement, which we thought was rowing back. But in theory, Parliament will have a vote, whether or not there's a referendum. People tend to forget the House of Lords. I mean, it is an appalling situation when our second chamber consists of people who are appointed on a crony basis, but they do exist and they're powerful, and they predominantly remain, and they've got more independence from whips than people in the Commons. So those are quite important constraints of the legislative kind. Secondly, as you know in Scotland, these things have to go through a devolution filter. So very strong objections in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland could cause further difficulties because there are certain clauses in the exit agreements that will have to be devolution compatible, and I don't expect the Scottish Government to be helpful. I mean, very good reason. Why should they? And I think there are several issues of that kind. And then thirdly, there's a whole set of very specific pieces of legislation which would relate, for example, to nationality questions and elsewhere, where you may well get turbulence and rebellion. One of the things we haven't talked about is about immigration policy, where the government is getting itself into a terrible tangle. You know, the Brexit vote was won in many parts of England on an anti-immigrant kind of platform. The government is now trying to translate that prejudice into practical reality that will have to be legislated on. And they've now got themselves into an absurd situation of arguing that unskilled work should be reserved for the British. I struggle to get my head around the logic of this, but that's what they're now saying, and that's got to be translated into law. And I think, quite apart from the Great Repeal, there will be very specific bits of legislation that will cause the government a lot of problems. It will go on forever, I fear. You know, this is the great tragedy about this, that it's both now and in the long-term future. I mean, you can see this in the British government, that all the energy is being sucked out of every other subject. I mean, there are lots of other things, you know, most of us here feel quite passionately about, you know, maybe about schools or health or civil liberties or whatever. There is no energy at all in Whitehall for dealing with those issues. The most capable civil servants, the most energetic ministers are all now being put on the Brexit beat. And they're going to be there for a very long time, and all the other issues are going to be put on the back burner. And as you rightly say, when things start going wrong, there will be a need for scapegoats. And it will either be because Brexit has happened or because it hasn't happened. And in a way, this is, you know, somebody asked me if I was optimistic. I mean, in many ways I'm optimistic, but I think that we're going to live with this for years and years and years. And, you know, and if I was a young person, you know, who voted for Remain, whether in Scotland or not, and you see all this coming down the track, and, you know, 20 years' time, your life has been blighted in some way or the other, of course, it's all going to come back to this question. So I sense that this is one of these issues that's going to go on and on and on and on. And anyway, the best way, in my view, of stopping that happening is to get the exit from Brexit. Well, I've written to the Prime Minister and asked if she'd release the papers. No, I mean, the story here was, this was an ongoing argument in the coalition government. My party was fundamentally at odds with most of the Conservative ministers over Europe. Not all of them. There were some very pro-Europe Tories at that time, anyway. And one of the things we did was to carry out what we called a review of competencies. It was an attempt to try and get a consensus amongst us on Europe. It's quite hard work. And I commissioned through BIS a whole series of studies and pulling together academic studies about what impact does immigration actually have. Now, what's the evidence as opposed to all the assertions? I didn't know what the answer would be, but what the work did tend to suggest was that immigration actually had very little impact on wages. I mean, it does in some areas and in some industries, so it's not completely absent, but the overall impact was very, very small. And the reason for that is fairly obvious when you think about it. Many of the people who come in to pick fruit or clean loos or whatever they do are doing jobs that British people didn't want to do. So they're not actually competing. And that explains why the impact on the labour market is very limited. But it has now become part, Theresa May repeated in Parliament last week, we must drastically cut down on the importation of immigrants because they're driving down our wages. It's a rather desperate attempt to appeal to the working class voters, particularly.
It's not possible to bring this to.
But the evidence isn't there, and as I say, the analysis is there, and a lot of it's published. But I have written to Theresa May and said, look, it's all sitting in my old department. Bring it out, publish it. Let's see what the facts are.
Anyone?
No, you're right. There is a complete absence of strategic thinking. There's one sense in which she's right, which is that we've chronically underinvested in skills in the UK for over generations. Lack of attention to vocational education, this belief everybody should go to university and you don't have apprenticeships like the Germans and so on. So, if one of the side effects of Brexit is to make the UK concentrate more and more strategically on training and bringing the skill level up of the British labour force, that will be a positive. But to be frank, I don't see much evidence of that happening in practice.
But they could have done that.
Yeah.
They could do that.